Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about something that turns the corner a bit. The Lesbian Project, which is a good news story. This was your initiative. And had you been thinking about this for some time, or did the idea just come up to you in one of your sleepless nights? And, can you talk a bit about the concept and the vision when you first dreamed it up?
It was obvious because of widespread misogyny. Of course, trans activism is but a symptom of widespread misogyny. It didn't grow out of nothing. It didn't just all of a sudden rear its head and, oh my God, there's transgender ideology. It was clearly because misogyny allowed it to flourish and be rewarded and congratulated. Obviously, the kind of canary in the coal mine were lesbians. This affected all women and girls, and gay men to an extent, but lesbians we had really fought for our rights and our freedom, our relative freedom. We'd fought for our sexual autonomy, and we had particularly fought for our own spaces, our physical spaces, in which we could meet each other, we could meet friends, we could plan feminist action and pro-lesbian initiatives, and we could meet, sexual romantic partners. I mean, it was just so important for us to have those spaces. And of course, they were then increasingly under threat and then became de facto illegal and unacceptable in polite society to even say that lesbians are female, same-sex attracted individuals. And so the other thing that had happened increasingly since the mid to late 1980s as a response to, in the UK, Section 28, which was the first piece of legislation that was ever directed at lesbians and gay men together. And it was our local authority act. It was brought in by the Thatcher government, the right-wing government, that forbade teachers and local authority workers to present same-sex relationships as positive in any way. So that was that legislation. So for the first time, since the Gay Liberation Front in the early 70s, lesbians, got together with gay men and said, let's protest this. And then, of course, there was the AIDS crisis, and many lesbians prioritised that and the well-being of gay men. And it was a terrible, terrible time where gay men were vilified, and some of that spilt over into the lives of lesbians. But prior to that, we had been autonomous movements because lesbians are women and gay men are gay men, and we have nothing in common except for occasionally the same enemy. But when queer theory became so prevalent in universities and then in the mainstream, we were forced teamed with gay men and bisexuals and queers and whoever. And so we lost our autonomy as lesbians. Every time a piece of research was commissioned at government level or big think tanks that were looking at the lives of lesbians and gay men, it was lesbians and gay men. We didn't have anything that looked at our own needs: health, housing, relationships, children, family life, sexual violence, mental health and well-being. We were lumped in with gay men, and that could not be more inappropriate. It could not be more inappropriate. And so this had been happening for a long time. And then I got to know Kathleen Stock. We became very good friends during the time that she was speaking out, significantly before she was then hounded out of her job as Professor of Philosophy at Sussex University, which I'm sure, you all know the story. And Kathleen and I were talking about how lesbians are force-teamed, and we both, and I was at the time suing a publication called Pink News, which is a gay gutter press that had defamed me repeatedly and defamed, many other lesbians and women, just absolutely crazed trans rights activist. And so we just talked about how we really needed to have a kind of a think tank specifically for lesbians. And we then went ahead and set it up. We managed to raise some money. We were very, very well supported from a number of lesbians who are our advisors, and our patron is Martina Navratilova. Couldn't have a better patron. And we are now, we've been up and running for a year and a half, and before that we were doing lots and lots of groundwork. And in order to pull some funding in, and also because it's great fun, we have a weekly podcast called the Lesbian Project Podcast. And we have some many subscribers, some of whom are paid subscribers, which is what goes into fund the work that we're doing, including lots of research and advocacy. And it's really great because we'll record an episode tomorrow morning. So we usually record our episode on Monday morning, and it goes out on Friday mornings. And it's not scripted, but we have
topics there.
We have topics, and we have themes, and we have a read of certain things that are happening, and some serious, some irritatingly mad, and some very very funny. So we both enjoy doing it a lot.
Oh, that's great. Can you tell me how many subscribers you have? And I'm one of the founding ones, so I was early in with the money. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate all our subscribers, but obviously we particularly appreciate those that can afford to give us some. We have thousands. Good. We have thousands. I haven't looked recently, but we have a significant number of subscribers. But
good.
And we're coming up to a year. Now, and so it's our anniversary. In a couple of weeks, and we've actually just put out on our Substack, where we host the Lesbian Project podcast, with a nice discount for those that wish to remain with us and sign up again, and for any new subscribers. So it's brilliant. We love it.
Well, it wraps up my week nicely on a Friday. I look forward to it. And good. I love that you rant and you argue and you burst into uncontrollable laughter. That's my favorite. You have passionate disagreements. I think that's really important. And so you think you'll be able to maintain that weekly, you're going to hang in there and do that weekly podcast, hopefully?
I think so. We as I say, we enjoy it. I mean, it's quite a time commitment. It is. We like to do it because it also means that we're connecting to those that support the Lesbian Project in general. And we're also talking about lesbians on a weekly basis and on a kind of, public platform, which I think we need more of that. And Kathleen and I, anyone that knows, I mean, Kathleen was over in Vancouver a little while back this year, and some of those on this Zoom will have seen her, and we're very different people, but we connect in some very important ways, but we don't agree with each other on so many things. We have different styles, we have different approaches, and I find that very healthy, actually, because I'm sure we have some kind of shared values, and then we have some big differences, which is very very stimulating, I think, in conversation.
I'm happy about it. Yeah, it would be kind of boring to have two identical people sitting there going, yeah. So it's great. It's a great dynamic, and it's lots of fun. And I agree that you've brought people from all over the world, I'm sure, many parts of the world, and it's a place where we feel like we're part of a bigger community too, that we're those of us that are participating in it. So
good.
And I love that there's fun in this work that we do. It can get so dark and stressful, and fun is very important.
Completely agree. Absolutely agree.
Hello, it's the host here. I've turned on the Q&A.
What's that?
Turned on the Q&A.
You turn on the Q&A. Okay, so we'll get people to start putting questions in, but we'll grab them shortly. We've got about 25 more minutes, so we'll wrap up our conversation in about 5, and then do some questions. So yeah, people can start putting them in there, and we'll pull them out. I do want to talk about your new podcast, Julie and Genderland, and where you kind of moved into a slightly different territory, parents and children who are being affected by gender ideology through schools mainly, but also online through the medical system, social workers. That's a really key one. It's true that in Canada too, that children in care or cared for children, you call them in the UK, I think we call them children in care here, are highly represented in transitioning children. I just finished listening to it. I had to do it in small spurts. It was heartbreaking to hear the stories of these families, and because you've met them and you've heard them, and I mean, they're inspiring in some ways, but it's heartbreaking what they've been through and are going through still. And often Canadians like us look to all the progress made by feminists in the UK because you've been more openly fighting for women's and children's rights there, and belief in science and biology. And some of it is, I think, because there's a history of a certain kind of protest in the UK that we don't have here so much.
Yeah.
We're spread out so far geographically. We can't say, oh, I'll drive up to see you. You're in Toronto. Okay, I'll see you in 4 days, because it's like you can't take a train to go and meet with people across the country the way we do. But, the progress that's been made in the UK, and there has been a lot, cases that have been won, and women are supposed to be, can organize themselves now. But it doesn't seem to have moved the needle for children and youth as much as we hoped. I know the story of the Tavistock Gender Clinic and the Cass report, but can you talk a little bit about your podcast and how it came about, and how people feel, how the general mood is, how people feel about what is the state of things going with kids in schools and young people like that?
Obviously, we're far ahead than Canada and America. You have a worse situation than we do.
Yes.
And actually a lot of the problems that we face, such as with the Guardian newspaper, I used to be a prolific writer for the Guardian. I really started my journalism by writing for the Guardian back in the early 2000s, and it's heartbreaking to see that it has become so captured by trans ideology and lost its kind of journalistic and liberal values, where obviously you explore an issue from every single mainstream point of view. And it stopped doing that when it got scared from the US desk. Actually, the Guardian is massively influenced by the editorial coming from its US counterpart. And of course, the problem in North America, as we see it, is that because there's very, very little radical grassroots feminism there. It's mainly liberal, lean-in, kind of mainstream feminism, equality feminism. That the narrative about transgender ideology and issues such as surrogacy and so-called sex work and the like is very monolithic. So when the US desk at The Guardian says that anyone that is critical of men who claim to be women in spaces such as bathrooms and prisons and refuges, shelters, they can't differentiate between Donald Trump and his general bigotry towards all people who are different, lesbians, gay men, single mothers, women, of course. They think that means that we are all basically Donald Trump. And of course, those of us with any political acumen, and those of us on the left, as feminists tend to be, find Trump's bigotry abhorrent. but of course, we're lumped in with him because we also
Mm-hmm.
criticise
Mm-hmm.
transgender ideology, as
Mm-hmm.
does he. So that's the kind of unsophisticated, unnuanced, quite frankly, stupid position.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in Canada, you've got Trudeau, who is a
Mm-hmm.
major disaster, as we know. So, so what's happening in the UK is not as bad as what's happening in what we affectionately call Tranada,
Right.
but it's still pretty bad. But we
Mm-hmm.
have been lucky in that we have had now for many years several whistleblowers who are
Mm-hmm.
clinicians working in the field of so-called gender medicine, who have
Mm-hmm.
seen that this is a kind of accelerated, particularly insidious form of gay conversion therapy,
Mm-hmm.
lesbian conversion therapy of young
Yes.
people, and
Yes.
have recognized that young people being railroaded into these gender clinics have a
Mm-hmm.
myriad of problems.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they're trapped in the wrong body. They
Mm-hmm.
are traumatized. They are being abused. They
Mm-hmm.
are autistic. They are same-sex attracted and being bullied for
Mm-hmm.
it. But they are not trapped in the wrong body. As we know, there
Mm-hmm.
is no such thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had several brave whistleblowers,
Mm-hmm.
and we've also had the Cass report. So
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hilary Cass, who is an expert paediatrician, was commissioned because we made such a fuss about the transing of children, particularly girls. The spike in
Mm-hmm.
girls presenting at gender clinics
Mm-hmm.
was 8,000 plus
Mm-hmm.
increase.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of us made a huge, huge fuss from every single walk of
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cass report was commissioned, and it was a very thorough piece of work. And
Mm-hmm.
it showed conclusively that there's no benefit whatsoever in
Mm-hmm.
puberty blockers, that you shouldn't pause puberty, that the majority, that in fact, almost every single individual child that's ever gone on puberty blockers goes on to take cross-sex hormones and
Mm-hmm.
suffers irreversible damage.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's medical evidence coming out of this, but there's also evidence that we particularly highlighted in the podcast Julie in Genderland, which
Mm-hmm.
you can find on all of the platforms,
Mm-hmm.
that parents, and I mean good, decent parents who wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
mind if their kids came back and said they were lesbian or gay,
Mm-hmm.
just ordinary, regular people,
Mm-hmm.
were being pushed out of decisions made in conjunction with school teachers, with social workers, for children to socially transition. And one of the really important things that Hilary Cass said is that social transition isn't a neutral or harmless act.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a girl called Nicole, and you go to school and you are allowed to be referred to as Danny,
Mm-hmm.
and have pronouns he, him, and wear a boy's uniform if there are uniforms, and use the boys' toilets, bathrooms, well, that is a difficult path to then leave.
Mm-hmm.
And also what you're doing is you're shutting out parents, non-abusive parents,
Mm-hmm.
from the safeguarding of their own child.
Mm-hmm.
And this is happening to parents who encounter social services because complaints are made about transphobia, because they won't allow their child to identify as the opposite sex. They won't use opposite sex pronouns for them. They don't accept the fallacy. They won't affirm, because the schools are doing it. Social services are doing it. Children have been removed from their parents. Parents have been prevented from caring for and protecting their children. And whilst recognizing that not all parents are loving and protective of their kids, most are. And it's never protective of children to go along with a fantasy that they are trapped in the wrong body. So they're the stories we told. We also have experts such as Dr. Az Hakim, who was one of the early whistleblowers, who identified transing of kids as modern day conversion therapy. Stephanie Arai Davis from Transgender Trend, who started back in 2015 looking at what was happening in schools, where schools were indoctrinating kids in gender ideology. And Hannah Barnes, who wrote a brilliant book, Time to Think, investigated the gender identity clinic at the Telegraph Stock and Portman, where so much of this scandal is rooted in, and others who, and including a young woman who now is living happily as a lesbian with a girlfriend who had been through the whole trans, you know, she'd been given testosterone, ended up in hospital with severe headaches as a result of the testosterone. And she was asked by a good doctor, they should all be like this, are you saying you're now a boy because you were bullied at school? And she said yes. And the parents who desperately tried to affirm her in her trans identity suddenly thought, what the hell have we done? What have we done? And started researching this madness and supported this girl, this young woman, through reversing that whole transition. And for her, it wasn't too late. For many, of course, it is too late.
That was one of the good, happy stories. And she's a very bright girl. Yeah, that was great. Yeah. Well, I encourage everybody who's listening on this webinar to check out Julie and Genderland. And there's, I think, 9 parts. Some are half hour, some are 45 minutes. It's a great thing to do when you're having a bath, listen to a podcast, going for a walk, listen to the next one. It's really a powerful piece, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had more I want to ask, but I'm going to open up the Q&A instead, because I know we've got about 15 minutes left, and we'll see what people might have to say, and you can answer some questions from the attendees. So, okay, Claire, do you see much overlap in the UK between pro-trans activists and those who deny that Hamas carried out rapes, murders, and kidnappings last October?
Oh, yes. So there are some truths that we can attach to this mad movement of blue-fringed lunatics. And one is that those that say trans women are women will inevitably say sex work is work. It's that there's barely any any kind of exception to that rule. So they'll say sex work is work. They'll also say surrogacy is a human right. Having your own child is a right, and it's homophobic to be against it because gay men are infertile.
Right.
And we've got a new kid on the block, which is the river to the sea, uneducated, ill-informed, often deeply, consciously anti-Semitic nonsense of university students and others deciding that they will join queers for Hamas. Right. That to take out the leader of Hezbollah is, a terrible human rights violation. That, the Israelis should, there should be ceasefire now without any notion of what would then happen to citizens. And I speak from a point of view where I think Netanyahu is an absolute psychopath. And if I could personally assassinate him, trust me, I would. I'm deeply critical of some of the actions of the Israeli state towards particularly Gazans, but also on the West Bank, the checkpoints and the like. But I also do know my history, and I do understand some of what happens to Israel and the attack and constant, need to defend itself. And I also understand the overkill that has occurred since the pogrom, because it was a pogrom, of October the 7th. And so for me, it's simply a fashionable position to take, that you instantly go from, oh, okay, there's all of these women and men and children raped, murdered, and the like by Hamas in an unprovoked terrorist attack, to, well, the goodies are the Palestinians, because The Israelis are just right-wing Zionists and anyone that
Hmm.
supports the state of Israel to exist, which
Hmm.
incidentally I do support its right to exist, that they are the baddies. And
Hmm.
so they're all settler colonialists. Anyone that was born in Israel, lives in Israel, has anything to do really in not trying to condemn the state of Israel,
Hmm.
is one of those that would shoot trans babies dead, that
Hmm.
would definitely murder sex workers,
Hmm.
that would cause terrible harm to all marginalized people, and therefore we're on the side of Hamas. And we
Hmm.
have seen this in London 2 days after this pogrom. We went from that, the bodies were still warm, and immediately there were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of London shouting from the river to the sea without knowing which river, which sea,
I
or
know. I
anything
know.
about the Middle East.
I
And so,
know.
yeah. And I was talking to a young woman yesterday at a conference that I was speaking at, and she was speaking on the same panel as me. And she's at
Hmm.
one of the elite universities in Europe. And I vehemently disagreed with her on issues of male violence and feminism on that panel. But
Hmm.
afterwards, we were chatting, and she was telling me about what life is like at her university, where, if you do not swathe yourself in the Palestinian flag, and she said the trans flags now are invisible. It's all Palestinian flags. And if you don't say the right thing about the heroes being Hamas
Hmm.
and Hezbollah, then
Hmm.
you are a rabid racist,
Hmm.
anti-Palestinian,
Hmm.
genocidal maniac, and
Hmm.
that you're a right-wing Zionist. I mean, the
Hmm.
anti-Semitism is
Hmm.
off the scale, just
Hmm.
like with surrogacy, the misogyny is off the scale, but they think they're
Hmm.
supporting the right of these oppressed gay men who happen not to
Hmm.
have wombs. Who'd have thought it?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's crazy. I'm sorry that was a bit of a long answer, but
No,
I've been
that's okay.
so incensed by
Yeah.
this madness. I can barely just
Yeah.
think straight about it.
Well, with Netanyahu, you saying you hated Netanyahu, I heard from a friend that a friend of her friend, a friend of her friend who was an Israeli said, "Oh, I let's trade Netanyahu for the hostages." Early, right on in the thing, he said, we can get the hostages. Let's trade him."
I mean,
Anyway,
seriously,
so
I wish people would have just take 5 minutes to just have a look at what they are spouting about and
yes.
think. And then, I have friends, including lesbian friends, who are vehement supporters of Palestinian rights. They prioritize this
Hmm.
issue
Hmm.
and vehemently opposed to possibly to the existence of the state of Israel, even we
Hmm.
don't really go there. We
Hmm.
can manage
Hmm.
the conversation about
Hmm.
it because they would never deny the fact, the reality that women are always raped and sexually
Hmm.
assaulted and sadistically tortured
Hmm.
during any war.
That's right.
This happens. So why deny it for this?
Yeah.
It's like they're the wrong victims.
Yeah.
These women are the wrong victims.
Yeah. Let's avoid the whole complicated picture and just talk about one thing. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm going to go to another question. Sophia asked, what's currently happening in Germany with respect to gender ideology, and how do you perceive women's global protests potentially impacting the laws?
Well, I mean, Canada's such a huge country,
Hmm.
that I'm sure you appreciate the fact that Germany is quite, it's not round the corner from the
No,
UK.
no.
However, but we are constantly in touch
Hmm.
with feminists from different
Hmm.
countries,
Hmm.
nations, cultures, and obviously what's happening in Germany
Hmm.
is the same as what you've had in Canada for
Hmm.
some time, which
Hmm.
is self-identification, so that
Hmm.
there's no boundaries, there's no barriers whatsoever,
Hmm.
for men to identify as the opposite sex and invade our spaces and have more opportunity to cause us harm than they've already got.
Hmm.
So the feminists in Germany are great, and I know this from fighting alongside them against the legalization of prostitution in that country, which has been in place since the 1970s. And of course, as we said earlier, it's the same thing. It's all misogyny. It's all men's rights to colonize women's bodies in whichever way they choose. And so these feminists have, they've done their time in the trenches fighting state-sanctioned paid rape. And so I've got nothing but respect for these women that are fighting gender ideology in Germany, and we all need to give them a hand. And this is the great thing. There are terrible things that have come as a result of the technological revolution, but there are great things. We are now globalized as a women's movement.
Yes.
And we're able to travel, but we're also able to speak to each other as we are now.
Yes.
And so we do have these great connections. And I think that the more support we give, for example, the case Sal Grover, the giggle versus tickle and tickle versus giggle, you couldn't make it up case there, that we've all seen. We also know what's happening in across Canada with gender ideology, the same in countries in Europe. And so it's same old, and we need to operate and respond as a global feminist movement, which we are.
Yes. Yes, Natalie, I could. Vancouver Lesbian, this is an announcement from Natalie from Vancouver Lesbian Collective, who does great work. I'm wondering, Vancouver Lesbian Collective is planning an in-person event with Julie at the end of November. Oh, you're just Canada. That's great. So stay tuned for more details about that. So there you go. Thanks, Natalie, for putting that out there. That's great.
We're very excited about that. Very excited about going back to Vancouver. I was in Vancouver last September and had a great time. And this is a public event, and I'm very excited about it.
Oh, good. Well, I missed the smaller event. I live on Vancouver Island, so I wasn't able to go to that one, but I'll go to the larger public event in November. That's great. Yeah.
Right.
Chris, can a question be asked from the host?
What's that?
Can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
Julie, could you please expand more on how we have lost lesbian spaces and dating apps where lesbians are shamed for not wanting penis sex?
Well, obviously, often the culture leaps above the law when it comes to misogyny and challenging or eroding women's rights. So the law doesn't state quite yet in the UK that we would be acting illegally to exclude men who identify as trans women. In other words, just men who claim to be lesbians. But often venues in the UK are closed down if it's obvious that men are in the room wearing a dress or whatever, claiming to be lesbians. That has happened. The venue then closes, shuts down because of so-called transphobia. Women have been kicked off dating apps for stating that they wish to only have suggestions for dates of female only, biological female only. They're booted off the app. The apps are dominated by men claiming to be women. Men will turn up at lesbian spaces. It becomes pretty impossible to operate if you're running, for example, a disco evening or a venue running a kind of club environment, and say only biological females are welcome, because instantly you get threatened with various pieces of legislation because people don't understand the law. They don't understand that gender identity in the UK under our Equality Act is not a protected characteristic. That there are protected characteristics in law, unfortunately, for men that have got a gender recognition certificate in some circumstances. But what it means is the pressure on venues and the pressure from those running the apps means that lesbians are constantly kicked out, constantly threatened. There's pickets and demonstrations outside venues where we might be very openly trans exclusionary, and so it's that level of bullying that women sometimes feel the necessity to capitulate, but thankfully many don't.
Yes, and And so are lesbians, any cases going forward on that as far as lesbian spaces in the UK? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Watch this space. There is a legal challenge that the Lesbian Project and various other lesbian groups are
Okay.
participating in. So we'll keep you informed on that.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's great. I know Julie has to go in a few minutes, but I'll see if there's one more question here. Yes, there we go. What about some lesbian wins? Can you share any information about other actions or projects you're aware of, like the Lesbian Project, that we may not be aware of?
Yeah, there are some amazing lesbian groups. There's Lesbian Labour, which is our, women that have stuck around in our Labour Party to fight for the rights of lesbians. There are all kinds of groups, such as Get the L Out, meaning let's have separate autonomous organisations and identity and actions for lesbians. There are many, many groups that have formed in order to reassert our autonomous identity and politics, and also, social lives and friendship groups. So yeah, there's lots of good news about lesbians reasserting those rights, forming groups, getting together, and we've kind of got a bit of a renewed lesbian political culture going on right now. So I think that always happens when there's a terrible backlash. We've stepped up to the mark, and I'm sure that's also happening. I know it's happening also in Canada, because I've interviewed women in Canada for my forthcoming book, and they're not having it. They're not having it.
No. Yeah, for sure. And there was just a lesbian conference in Australia. There's a small group of lesbians there that organize social events. I talked to myself and another lesbian talked to a woman there. She met with us, explained how her structure and her organization work, and they had an in-person conference, and they only organize in-person events. So even though they're in worse position than us, sex is not a protected category in their Charter of Rights like it is in Canada. So we have both sex as a protected and gender identity, and I think even gender presentation, whatever that means, as an identity. So we have conflicting rights, which is why we're going to need to clear that up
of course.
Relatively soon. And now I want to thank Julie. I know you're like the busiest feminist I've ever heard of, and doing so much great work. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you coming and talking to our little group in the evening there. And you've got an evening thing you're going off to, or you probably have to have dinner and such. So thanks again for having a conversation with us, and thanks for your books and your podcasts. And we'll see you in November.
And thank you for everything you do. It's been great. And we'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody.